She gave birth 10 times. 6 of those children never lived to grow old. Seongnyeong Wanghu, Queen of Joseon, carried not only the crown, but the unbearable silence of a grieving mother. War tore her palace apart. Famine followed. And in the shadows of the throne, she buried child after child. When death finally came to her at 79, it was not triumph that remained, but the echo of loss too heavy for history to remember. She was born in 1556, in a world already weighed down by ritual and duty. Her name was Han Song-yi, though history would one day call her Seongnyeong Wanghu, the Queen of Joseon. From her first breath, she belonged not only to her family, but to the expectations of a dynasty. The Han clan of Cheongju was old, proud, and powerful. To be born into it was to inherit both privilege and burden. Their daughters were trained as ornaments of virtue, their sons as scholars and officials. The household whispered Confucian ideals into the ears of every child: obedience, restraint, discipline. For a girl like Song-ai, even laughter was measured, even movement was taught. She would walk not as she pleased, but as propriety demanded. Her early life passed within walls of polished wood and paper screens. She saw little of the outside world. Lessons filled her days: calligraphy, poetry, music, etiquette. Her teachers drilled her on how to bow, how to lower her gaze, how to keep her voice soft yet firm. A woman of Joseon was not meant to shine brighter than men. She was meant to reflect their glory, like the moon borrowing light from the sun. Yet even in that strict world, there was tenderness: family gatherings beneath blossoming plum trees, spring festivals where lanterns floated like stars on water. On rare evenings, she could hear music from the capital drifting through the wind: the plucking of gyeojeum strings, the steady beat of drums. Such sounds stirred a longing in her, though she could not name it. A longing for something beyond duty, beyond expectation. But destiny was already waiting. By the time she was 13, whispers of marriage had begun. Not to a common nobleman, but to a king. Seongnyeong of Joseon had taken the throne in 1567, young and ambitious, yet already wary of enemies at court. He needed a queen who could secure alliances, calm rivalries, and give him heirs. The Han family, with their deep roots and unshakable prestige, offered the perfect answer. Song-ai was chosen. There was no question of her own desire. Marriage was not a union of hearts, but a transaction of power. At 15, she left the home of her parents and entered the labyrinth of the royal palace. It was a place that shimmered with gold and jade, yet beneath its beauty lay cold calculation. Every corridor hummed with whispers, every chamber carried unseen eyes. The ceremony that declared her queen was magnificent. Court officials lined in rows, robes like ripples of crimson and blue. Music rose, solemn and slow. Incense smoke curled into the sky, as though carrying her childhood away. She knelt, bowed, and was crowned as the central palace, Yeongjeon, the queen consort of Joseon. She was now the mother of the nation. But what did that mean for a girl barely 16? It meant her body was no longer hers. It belonged to the dynasty. It meant her every word, every gesture, would be weighed like grain on a scale. It meant silence, even when her heart screamed. The older women of the court instructed her how to receive foreign envoys with grace, how to manage the inner palace where rival concubines already watched her with narrowed eyes, how to comfort the king, and when to step back into shadow. Yet beneath the rules and rituals, she remained human. A girl who once played beneath plum blossoms, a daughter who once laughed without fear, now a queen whose destiny was written in the womb. She was expected to give birth again and again until the dynasty felt secure. For the Han clan, her elevation was triumph. For Seonjo, it was strategy. For the people, it was stability. But for Song-ai herself, it was the slow surrender of self. Even so, she did not resist. Confucian teaching left no room for resistance. Instead, she embraced her role with quiet strength. She became the dutiful wife, the patient listener, the gracious queen. To the outside world, she was everything a consort should be. But history is cruel in what it forgets. We know little of her private joys, if they existed. Did she find moments of laughter with her handmaids? Did she hold the king's gaze with affection or with resignation? Did she ever look into the night sky and wonder what her life might have been, had she not been born to duty? The chronicles are silent. All we are left with is the image of a young queen standing at the threshold of decades of sorrow. She could not yet know how many children she would bury. She could not yet know how war would burn her palace and drive her into exile. She could not yet know that she would live long enough to see sons betray each other for a crown. But perhaps she sensed it. Perhaps on the day she became queen, as incense drifted and drums thundered, she felt the faint shadow of tragedy, a shadow that would follow her for 79 years. And so the girl of the Han clan stepped into history, not as herself, but as Seongnyeong Wanghu, the queen who would bear 10 children, lose 6, and carry the unbearable silence of a grieving mother. Her story had only begun. In 1569, she was crowned as the queen consort of Joseon. She was only 13. The palace resounded with ceremony. Scholars in tall hats bowed low. Officials in crimson robes chanted words of loyalty. Drums thundered, flutes cried, the smell of incense mingled with candle smoke. In the eyes of the kingdom, she was no longer Han Song-yi. She was Yungjeon, the central palace, the mother of the nation. But the crown was not a gift. It was a weight. From that moment forward, she carried expectations that could crush stone. She was expected to be a symbol of stability, a vessel of virtue, a womb for heirs. The nation's eyes turned toward her, calculating her worth not in wisdom, not in kindness, not in character, but in children. And so, though she was still a teenager, she lived not as a girl, but as a queen. The palace was dazzling on the surface. Gold-threaded curtains swayed in the wind. Jade bowls gleamed in the light of oil lamps. Courtyards bloomed with chrysanthemums, carefully arranged by gardeners who served the throne. Yet beneath the beauty was suspicion. The court was filled with factions. Rival ministers whispered in corridors. Concubines, with painted faces and calculating smiles, measured her every move. To survive, she had to be flawless. Each morning began with ritual. She rose before dawn. Servants bathed her, dressed her, combed her hair into the elaborate bun of a queen. She sat for hours as attendants adjusted silk layers, pinned jewels, tied belts. Her face was powdered pale, her lips stained with subtle color. To the outside world, she appeared serene, unshaken, a portrait of grace. But serenity was only an illusion. Inside, she was learning to swallow fear. Fear of failure. Fear of being cast aside. Fear of disappointing the king, whose patience was thinner than parchment. At audiences, she stood beside him in silence, her head slightly bowed, her gaze lowered. She was the picture of humility. Yet every glance from the courtiers reminded her of her duty to give the king's sons That duty was merciless. In the quiet of the women's quarters, older consorts watched her. Some pitied her, others despised her. Every month that passed without news of pregnancy was whispered about. Every faint illness was discussed as an omen. She lived in a cage of expectations, where even her own body was no longer hers. And yet, she was young. Did she ever dream in those early years? Did she imagine happiness with Seonjo, a man she had barely known before marriage? Did she hope for affection? History does not tell us. What we do know is that she fulfilled her role. She conceived and she bore children. The court recorded them with cold precision, as if cataloging items in a ledger. A prince, a princess, another prince. But when those children died in infancy, the record simply moved on. For the court, they were numbers. For her, they were lives. But those losses came later. In these early years, the burden of possibility still hung over her. She walked the palace gardens with attendants trailing behind, cherry blossoms drifting across her shoulders. She performed ancestral rites with unwavering composure, bowing deeply before the spirit tablets of kings long dead. She welcomed foreign envoys with formal smiles, though she understood little of their strange languages. And always, she returned to silence. The silence of a queen whose life was measured by others. The silence of a young woman who had become a symbol long before she had lived her own story. Her husband, King Seonjo, was ambitious but cautious. He leaned on his ministers, distrusted rivals, and surrounded himself with scholars. To him, his young queen was both asset and necessity. He needed her to be steady. He needed her to produce heirs. And so he watched her closely, judging not her heart, but her usefulness. There must have been nights when she felt the weight most sharply. Nights when she lay beneath silk canopies, the palace quiet except for the distant cry of a night bird. Did she feel loneliness then, despite being surrounded by attendants? Did she close her eyes and remember the simpler air of her childhood home? The plum blossoms, the spring festivals, the sound of music drifting through the wind? If she did, she kept it to herself. For she knew there was no turning back. She was now bound to the throne, bound to duty, bound to a future she could neither choose nor refuse. The chronicles describe her as virtuous, composed, dutiful, words that repeat like echoes through the records of Joseon queens. But such words conceal the human beneath. They hide the trembling of a girl who had barely crossed into womanhood. They erase the quiet despair of one who understood, even in her youth, that her body was not her own. And yet, she endured. She played her part with the precision of ritual. She moved through the palace like a shadow carved in silk. And slowly, she grew into her crown. But history would not allow her peace. The years ahead would demand more than grace. They would demand blood. They would demand children. They would demand grief beyond imagining. For now, she remained the young queen. And though she stood at the center of power, she was already beginning to learn the bitter truth. That power does not shield, it only isolates. The girl of the Han clan had become Joseon's queen. But the cost of her crown was only beginning to be revealed. Her duty was clear. She was queen. She was womb. She was expected to give life. The palace watched her every step. Attendants counted her meals. Physicians measured her pulse. Ministers whispered about omens, as though the future of the dynasty lived within her veins. Even the king, restless, ambitious Seonjo, measured her worth through the children she bore. And so, year after year, she conceived. Pregnancy in Joseon was not gentle. There were no soft assurances, no private sanctuaries. A queen's body was public property. When she swelled with child, the court rejoiced. When she bled, the court despaired. Her suffering was recorded not as pain, but as policy. The chronicles write it coldly. In this year, a prince was born. In this year, a princess died. No detail of tears, no mention of screams in the night, no record of her holding a still infant, body small and breathless. But we can imagine. She gave birth 10 times. 6 of those children did not live to see adulthood. 6 times she cradled life, only to watch it fade. Some died in infancy, others in fragile youth. Each one took a piece of her with them. Yet in the eyes of the court, it was failure. Failure to secure the line, failure to stabilize the throne, failure to fulfill the singular duty of a queen. Imagine the cruelty of such judgment. A mother burying child after child, accused not of grief, but of inadequacy. Her arms empty, her heart fractured, yet her face forced into composure. She was not allowed to wail. She was not allowed to falter. She was expected to bow at ceremonies as though nothing had happened. Grief became her secret language. We can almost see her walking through the palace gardens, cherry blossoms falling, her gaze fixed on the earth where her children now slept. Servants trailed her, careful not to speak. The air itself seemed heavy with silence. And always, the cycle continued. Another pregnancy, another confinement, another moment of hope wrapped in fear. Did she whisper prayers into the night, asking the ancestors to spare her children? Did she cling to the thought that one child might live long enough to carry the dynasty forward? Hope and despair were her constant companions. The court, however, moved on quickly. Ministers debated policy. Generals trained soldiers. Scholars copied texts. Life in Joseon did not pause for the tears of one woman, even if she wore the crown. Still, her pain seeped into the palace. The other women of the court, concubines and attendants alike, saw the shadow in her eyes. Some pitied her. Others, perhaps, felt triumph. For in the cruel logic of the palace, a queen who failed in childbirth could be replaced. The king had concubines. They bore children too, rivals to her own, threats to her place. Her body became battleground. Every child lost was not only a heartbreak, but a political wound. Every death weakened her position and strengthened that of another woman. The palace walls echoed with prayers, but also with schemes. For in Joseon, motherhood was more than love. It was power. And so, her sorrow was not only private, it was public humiliation. Imagine her face at court ceremonies. The king beside her, ministers before her, eyes sharp with judgment. She bowed. She smiled faintly. But inside, her soul was fractured. A queen, adorned in jewels, yet buried in grief. How did she endure? Perhaps she buried her sorrow in ritual, lighting incense, reading scriptures, whispering prayers. Perhaps she found moments of solace in the company of her surviving children, clinging to them with fierce devotion. Perhaps she told herself that endurance itself was victory. But the truth was harsher. She lived in a world where her value was measured in sons. And though she gave birth to many, fate stole most away. 6 small graves marked her failure. 6 absences marked her heart. And still, she had to continue. Because a queen cannot stop. A queen cannot rest. A queen cannot simply be a mother. The palace demanded more. Her womb was the battlefield. Her body was the treaty. Her children were the currency of power. And so she carried on. Each pregnancy a gamble with destiny. Each child both hope and fear. Each loss a reminder that even queens bleed, and even queens break. History records the numbers: 10 births, 6 losses. But numbers do not weep, numbers do not bury, numbers do not remember the smell of incense at small funerals, or the silence of empty cradles. She remembered. Every loss etched itself into her. Every burial deepened the shadow that would follow her to the end of her life. And though she was queen, she was also human. A mother stripped of joy, yet forced to wear a crown. This was the burden of birth. Not joy, not triumph, but grief. And the cruelest truth of all, it was only the beginning. In 1592, fire came to Joseon. The Imjin War began. Japanese armies crossed the sea with ruthless precision. Cities burned, villages collapsed, palaces trembled. The once stable court of Joseon was thrown into chaos. And at the heart of that storm stood Seongnyeong Wanghu. She was queen, yet she was also a fugitive. The enemy advanced quickly. Seoul fell. The royal family had no choice but to flee north. They abandoned Gyeongbokgung, leaving behind halls that once glittered with jade and gold. The palace, symbol of power, now lay in ruins. The queen traveled with the king, ministers, and scattered members of the royal clan. But the road was not lined with honor. It was lined with hunger. Horses stumbled. Soldiers deserted. The air carried the smoke of burning towns and the cries of the displaced. Seongnyeong Wanghu, who had once presided over grand banquets, now tasted hunger herself. She ate what little the attendants could find: a handful of rice, a thin broth, some days nothing at all, and always the fear. Fear that the enemy would catch them. Fear that her children, already fragile, would fall ill. Fear that the dynasty itself would end, not through politics, but through fire and steel. For a mother, the war was merciless. Her youngest children, already weakened by sickness, struggled on the road. The cold nights pierced them. The damp air crept into their lungs. Small coughs became fevers. Fevers became funerals. The chronicles mention the losses only briefly, a line here, a name there. But for her, each death was another wound. To lose children in the palace was cruel enough. To lose them on the road, in exile, amidst the ruin of war, that was unbearable. The queen buried her grief in silence. She could not collapse. She could not stop. Ministers demanded decisions. Attendants demanded orders. Soldiers demanded direction. She was queen, and queens did not cry in public. And so she stood straight, even when her heart was breaking. The war raged on for years. She lived through flight after flight, retreat after retreat. She saw her people starve. She saw farmers flee from burning fields. She saw noble families abandon loyalty in the face of survival. The world she had known, the ordered, ritualized world of Joseon court life, dissolved into ash. Even the royal bloodline was not spared. Princes, raised in silk, now trudged through mud. Princesses, once adorned with jewels, now shivered in damp clothes. The dynasty that had ruled for 2 centuries was reduced to wandering refugees. And yet, the queen endured. Every morning, she rose, adjusted her robes, and reminded those around her that the throne still existed, that Joseon still lived, that the dynasty, though wounded, had not fallen. Her strength became not a luxury, but a necessity. But strength could not protect her children. Disease spread quickly in the camps. Food was scarce. Water often foul. One by one, the fragile ones slipped away. Each funeral was rushed. There was no time for ceremony. No great stone tombs, no long lines of mourners. A few attendants, a shallow grave, a mother who could not even grieve aloud. And then they moved on. The war carved itself into her bones. She aged faster. Her hair, once dark, began to silver. Her face, once youthful, grew thin and lined. She carried loss not only in memory, but in flesh. The court saw only survival. Ministers praised the dynasty's endurance. Historians later recorded Joseon's eventual victory, aided by allies and by sheer resilience. But none of them recorded the queen's private battles. They did not record the nights she lay awake, listening to her children's shallow breaths, praying they would last until dawn. They did not record the way her hands trembled when she touched the silk wrappings of a child who would never grow older. They did not record the hollow silence that followed each burial. History remembers war and battles. She remembered it in graves. When the Japanese armies were finally driven back, the palace was rebuilt. Ministers declared triumph. Generals celebrated their victories. The dynasty survived. But what did survival mean to her? She returned to the palace not with joy, but with ghosts. The halls were quiet. The courtyard still smelled of ash. Too many faces were missing. Too many children gone. She had been queen through famine and fire. She had walked as a refugee. She had buried her own blood by the roadside. And yet, the chronicles reduce it to silence. They do not say how she endured. They do not say how she kept walking, kept ruling, kept breathing. They do not say how a mother carried both crown and coffin in the same weary hands. But we can imagine. The war had stolen much from her. Her palace, her children, her peace. Yet it left her alive, condemned to live with memory. And so, when the fires finally dimmed, she stood in the palace once again, a queen, a survivor, a mother without most of her children. The shadow of war had passed over Joseon. But for Seongnyeong Wanghu, it never truly lifted. She was not only queen, she was not only consort, she was a mother. And mothers remember. Her body had endured the weight of 10 pregnancies. Her soul had endured the silence of 6 burials. 6 children gone. 6 names nearly erased from the court records, dismissed as brief notes in annals. But for her, they were not lines on paper. They were lives. The palace never let her forget. Every child lost was more than grief. It was judgment. Ministers whispered about fate. Concubines smirked behind their fans. The king, though bound by ritual to mourn, turned increasingly to other women to secure the dynasty. Each death was a wound. Each funeral was a humiliation. And yet, she endured. She buried her infants with her own prayers. She placed tiny hands into silk shrouds. She bowed before shallow graves. No trumpets sounded, no banners flew. Only silence, broken by the wail of a mother forced to lower her voice. In Joseon, grief was private. Publicly, a queen was meant to embody strength, stability, grace. But privately, Seongnyeong Wanghu wept, perhaps alone in her chamber, perhaps into her sleeve during night vigils, perhaps only in silence, tears hidden so that no one could call her weak. Her surviving children became all the more precious. She clung to them with fierce devotion. She watched them breathe at night, fearing the sudden stillness that had claimed their siblings. She memorized their voices, their footsteps, their laughter. For she knew how quickly those sounds could vanish. But fate was not merciful. Sickness came often. Small fevers, sudden chills, coughs that lingered until voices broke. Some children fought and survived. Others faded. The palace physicians offered tonics, prayers, rituals, But medicine in Joseon was fragile. Even the children of kings were not safe. And always, the queen watched. Her hands were soft with silk, but they were also hands that soothed burning foreheads. Her voice was gentle, but it was also a voice that whispered lullabies to children she knew might never see adulthood. Each loss deepened the shadow around her. She carried sorrow like a second crown, one for the court, glittering and visible, one for the grave, unseen but crushing. To the world, she remained the serene queen, the embodiment of order. To herself, she was the mother of losses. And the palace, that golden cage, turned her mourning into a spectacle. When a prince died, rituals had to be observed, processions arranged, names recorded in the genealogy. She walked in funerals that honored the dynasty, yet ignored her heart. For who spoke of a mother's pain in court records? Who remembered the lullabies, the small hands, the final breath? No one. She remembered alone. Perhaps this was the cruelest truth, that history remembers kings, battles, treaties, but not the tears of queens. Her grief was not written, it was lived, and it was endured in silence. Imagine her walking through the palace halls, empty cradles tucked away, small garments folded, unused, servants averting their eyes, unsure whether to speak. Each corridor carried ghosts, and still she lived. Still she smiled at ceremonies. Still she greeted envoys with courtesy. Still she bowed to ancestors. Still she played her role. But inside, she was breaking. The other women of the court understood, though they did not always pity her. For them, her losses were opportunity. The fewer surviving heirs she bore, the greater the chance for their own sons to rise. To them, her grief was weakness, and weakness was leverage. And so, in the cruelest irony, the queen, who had given so much, who had endured so much, became vulnerable. Her empty arms were turned against her. Her broken heart was used as weapon. Yet she did not collapse. Somehow she gathered the fragments of herself and kept moving. She poured her love into the children who lived. She offered prayers for those who had died. She carried both at once, the living and the dead, within her soul. The world called her queen. History called her consort. But beneath the titles, she was simply a mother. A mother who had lost more than she could ever bear. And that is how she lived. Haunted, hollow, yet unbroken. Every day she rose with the dawn, dressed in silk, adjusted her crown. Every day she stepped into a palace that measured her by what she could give, yet had already stolen so much. Every day she endured, carrying loss like an invisible shroud. Seongnyeong Wanghu was not remembered for victories, or for politics, or for brilliance. She was remembered, faintly, quietly, for loss. For being the mother of 10 and the mother of 6 graves. The war ended, but peace did not return. The palace still trembled. Joseon was exhausted. Fields burned, villages ruined, people starving. Soldiers limped home, their bodies broken. The dynasty had survived. But survival did not mean stability. It meant suspicion. It meant division. It meant whispers in the corridors of power. And at the center of it all stood the queen. Seongnyeong Wanghu had endured the war. She had endured famine. She had endured the loss of children. But what came after was no less cruel. Now she faced the palace itself, its intrigues, its rivalries, its betrayals. For in Joseon, war never ended. It only changed form. The battlefield became the royal court. The swords became words. The enemies became brothers. Her surviving sons were not safe. Each one carried ambition or became a pawn of ministers who whispered promises into their ears. Each one was seen not only as a child, but as a claimant to the throne. The queen, who should have been comforted by their survival, now watched them drawn into deadly games. The crown was not a blessing, it was a curse. King Seonjo himself fed the storm. He was restless, suspicious, and easily swayed by factions. He favored some sons, ignored others, and allowed ministers to manipulate his choices. Every gesture he made toward one child became a wound to another. The queen stood in the middle, powerless to stop it. She tried to keep the peace. She urged her sons toward harmony. She prayed they would remember their blood before their ambition. But ambition is stronger than memory, and the throne is hungrier than kinship. The palace echoed with rivalry. Concubines whispered that their sons deserved the crown. Ministers took sides, sharpening words like blades. Rumors spread faster than fire. Who would inherit Joseon? Which prince would rise? Which prince would fall? And the queen endured. She was mother, but she was also witness. She saw in her children's eyes both her blood and her helplessness. She loved them, but she could not protect them. Not from each other, not from the throne. The shadow of the crown divided them. Imagine her at night, sitting alone in her chamber, a single candle flickering, silk robes pooling around her feet. The echo of laughter from years ago, small voices of children playing in the courtyard, replaced now by silence, suspicion, and fear. She had lost 6 children to death. Now she feared losing the rest to power. The throne shook not because of foreign armies, but because of the family itself. And so, the queen aged. Her face grew pale, her eyes dark with sleeplessness. Every wrinkle was not only time, but grief, carved deeper by watching her sons circle the crown like wolves. The ministers debated day and night. They spoke of legitimacy. They spoke of succession. They spoke of the need for stability. But for her, it was not theory. It was flesh. It was blood. It was her children, turned into pawns. Even those who survived the war could not survive ambition. Her role as queen had ended long ago. Now, she was mother, grandmother, elder, but her title carried no power. She could only watch. Watch as her sons were elevated, then cast aside. Watch as one was named heir, only to be whispered against. Watch as another was condemned, his name smeared, his future erased. The throne was a shifting shadow. It promised glory, but gave ruin. And the queen knew it. She had worn the crown long enough to understand its hunger. It devoured families. It devoured peace. It devoured even love between mother and son. And yet she endured. Still she rose each morning. Still she dressed in silk. Still she sat at ceremonies, her face calm, her heart breaking. Still she carried herself with dignity, even as her family collapsed around her. For what else could she do? She was queen. She was mother. She was witness. But she was never allowed to be human. The chronicles record the succession struggles as politics, dates, edicts, factions. They do not record the silent grief of a mother who saw her family tearing itself apart. They do not record the way her gaze lingered on her sons, as though memorizing them before the throne consumed them. The throne shook. The dynasty trembled, and Seongnyeong Wanghu endured, not as victor, not as ruler, but as mother, broken yet unyielding. She had survived war. She had survived loss. Now she was forced to survive betrayal. And the cruelest truth of all, she knew it was only the beginning. In 1608, the king died. Seongnyeong of Joseon, husband, ruler, father, was gone. The palace shuddered with the news. Courtiers rushed through corridors. Ministers whispered of succession. Servants fell to their knees in mourning. Bells tolled, slow and heavy, echoing through Seoul. But for Seongnyeong Wanghu, it was not only the death of a monarch, it was the collapse of her last anchor. She had shared decades with him, decades of war, decades of famine, decades of children born and buried. Their marriage had not been tender, not always kind, not without betrayal. Yet he had been constant. As king, he was her shield. As husband, he was her tether to the throne. Now, he was gone. She was left standing in the palace, widowed, weary, surrounded by sons already circling the crown. Tradition gave her a new title. She became the Queen Dowager, or more formally, the Grand Queen Dowager, Wangdabi. It sounded powerful. It sounded majestic. But in truth, it was empty. Titles do not fill absence. Honorifics do not erase loneliness. Her chambers grew larger and colder. The courtiers, who once bowed deeply, now measured her with cautious eyes. Some still offered respect, others less so. She was no longer the queen at the king's side. She was the widow, the relic, the shadow of a dynasty already looking to the future. And that future was chaos. The question of succession exploded. Which son would ascend? Which faction would win? Even in Seonjo's last days, ministers had fought over the heir. Some pressed for Prince Gwanghae, a son born of a concubine, admired for his skill. Others whispered of different princes, claiming legitimacy, claiming divine favor. The king's deathbed was no peaceful passing. It was a battlefield. The Queen Dowager watched, powerless, as men argued in the very halls where her husband's body lay. They did not wait for mourning to end. They did not allow silence to fall. They argued as though the king were already forgotten. For her, the loss was personal. For them, it was opportunity. She wept quietly. Not in the throne room, not before ministers, but in the privacy of her chambers, perhaps into her sleeves, perhaps into silence. She was not allowed to wail like a widow. She was expected to remain composed, an emblem of dignity. But her heart was breaking. Seonjo had been many things, stubborn, ambitious, often distant. Yet he had been hers. He had been the father of her children, the man with whom she had shared half a lifetime of triumph and tragedy. His absence was a hole no title could fill. And with his death came another loss, her voice. For as long as he lived, she had influence, if only through him. Now, she had none. She was expected to withdraw, to remain in the background, to watch silently as others decided the fate of Joseon. And still, she remained. She wore white mourning robes. She performed rituals for his spirit. She bowed before his coffin, her body weak but unyielding. She fulfilled every duty with precision, as though clinging to the last role left to her. But the world moved on quickly. The ministers declared Gwanghae the new king. The throne shifted from her bloodline to another woman's son. Her years of sacrifice, of loss, of survival, all brushed aside in a single proclamation. What did she feel, watching another son crowned? Pride? No, bitterness? Perhaps, more than anything, grief. Grief for her husband, grief for her sons, overlooked. Grief for the life she had endured only to be left powerless. her palace grew lonelier still. Once, she had been at the center. Now, she was on the edges. Once, she had been the voice beside the king. Now, she was an old woman whose words carried little weight. And yet, she carried herself with dignity. Even in widowhood, even in silence, she remained queen. She endured court rituals. She endured shifting loyalties. She endured the sight of her sons stripped of power, her family weakened, her legacy fading. The chronicles describe Seonjo's death with ritual detail: the mourning, the funeral, the enthronement of his successor. But they do not describe her nights. They do not describe the silence of her chambers, where the absence of his voice was louder than any bell. They do not describe the way her hands, once steady, now trembled when she lit incense for his spirit. History remembers kings by their reigns. Queens are remembered by their silence. For Seongnyeong Wanghu, Seonjo's death was not only the end of a reign, it was the end of companionship, however flawed. It was the end of whatever protection she still possessed. It was the beginning of a deeper solitude. She had been wife, queen, mother. Now, she was widow. And as the palace moved forward, as Joseon crowned a new king, she remained in the shadows, a living ghost, carrying grief that no crown, no title, no ceremony could erase. Gwanghae ascended, not her son, not the heir she had prayed for. The crown passed instead to the child of a concubine. For the ministers, it was necessity. Gwanghae had proven himself capable during the war. He had shown cunning, resolve, and resilience. The kingdom was fragile, they argued. It needed strength more than legitimacy. But for Seongnyeong Wanghu, it was humiliation. She was the queen mother, the legal consort of Seonjo, the woman who had carried 10 pregnancies, who had buried 6 children, who had endured hunger, exile, and war. She was the rightful matriarch of Joseon. And yet, she was pushed aside. The throne now looked to another woman's son. Her voice, once sought in whispers, was now ignored in silence. Courtiers bowed out of formality, but their respect was hollow. They looked not at her, but at the new king. Her chambers became quiet, once filled with attendants and ministers seeking her favor. They now echoed with emptiness. Her role was reduced to rituals, ancestral rites, ceremonial appearances, token gestures of respect. Beyond that, she was invisible. And invisibility is a cruel prison. She lived in the palace still, surrounded by the architecture of power. Jade tiles, red pillars, carved dragons. But all of it was out of reach. She was like a bird caged inside a golden hall, able to see everything, yet unable to fly. Everywhere she turned, she saw reminders of her losses. The throne her sons could not claim. The courtiers who no longer bowed deeply. The officials who whispered that the Queen Mother was nothing more than a relic. And the cruelest wound, her surviving sons, the few she had clung to after burying so many, were now trapped in the endless rivalry that followed Gwanghae's rule. Some were sidelined, some were disgraced, some were quietly removed from the line of succession. She was a mother forced to watch her children defeated not by illness, not by war, but by politics. It was a different kind of death. Imagine her standing in a palace corridor, looking at her son's chambers from afar, guards stationed outside, ministers walking past without bowing. Her child, her flesh and blood, reduced to a name erased from the records of power. She could do nothing. Her years as queen had taught her silence. Her years as mother had taught her grief. Now her years as dowager taught her powerlessness. The humiliation deepened. When envoys came from Ming China, when court ceremonies took place, when the nation celebrated victories, her presence was barely acknowledged. She was brought forth for form, not for meaning. She was displayed, not respected. She had once been the axis of the palace. Now she was a shadow at its edge. And still she endured. She endured long corridors of whispers. She endured festivals where she sat alone, draped in silks that felt heavier than iron. She endured seeing younger concubines smile in triumph, their children now princes of influence. Her silence became her armor. The chronicles do not say much. They rarely do. They record names, titles, decrees. They do not record humiliation. They do not write of the loneliness of a queen mother forced to fade. They do not capture the bitterness of watching another woman's son sit where hers could not. But we can imagine. At night she sat in her chamber, a single candle flickering against painted screens. She remembered her early days when she was crowned queen. She remembered the king's gaze, sometimes warm, often cold. She remembered her children, laughing in the gardens, then falling silent one by one. And now she remembered what it felt like to be erased while still alive. For humiliation is not only in defeat, it is in invisibility. She still wore the robes of a dowager queen. She still held the title. She still walked through the palace with attendants trailing behind. But none of it mattered. She was a figurehead, a name on parchment, a woman emptied of influence. Her grief was private, her dignity public, her silence eternal. Gwanghae ruled. Ministers schemed. The court pulsed with ambition, and she, the once central queen, was pushed further into the shadows. The age of Gwanghae was remembered for turmoil, reform, division. But for Seongnyeong Wanghu, it was remembered for something else. For humiliation, for erasure, for the bitter truth that survival does not guarantee respect. She had outlived her husband. She had outlived 6 of her children. She had outlived war and famine. And now, she was forced to outlive her own place in history. The Queen Mother sat in silence, and silence was her final crown. Gwanghae ascended, not her son, not the heir she had prayed for. The crown passed instead to the child of a concubine. For the ministers, it was necessity. Gwanghae had proven himself capable during the war. He had shown cunning, resolve, and resilience. The kingdom was fragile, they argued. It needed strength more than legitimacy. But for Seongnyeong Wanghu, it was humiliation. She was the Queen Mother, the legal consort of Seonjo, the woman who had carried 10 pregnancies, who had buried 6 children, who had endured hunger, exile, and war. She was the rightful matriarch of Joseon. And yet, she was pushed aside. The throne now looked to another woman's son. Her voice, once sought in whispers, was now ignored in silence. Courtiers bowed out of formality, but their respect was hollow. They looked not at her, but at the new king. Her chambers became quiet. Once filled with attendants and ministers seeking her favor, they now echoed with emptiness. Her role was reduced to rituals, ancestral rites, ceremonial appearances, token gestures of respect. Beyond that, she was invisible. And invisibility is a cruel prison. She lived in the palace still, surrounded by the architecture of power. Jade tiles, red pillars, carved dragons. But all of it was out of reach. She was like a bird caged inside a golden hall, able to see everything, yet unable to fly. Everywhere she turned, she saw reminders of her losses. the throne her sons could not claim, the courtiers who no longer bowed deeply, the officials who whispered that the Queen Mother was nothing more than a relic. And the cruelest wound, her surviving sons, the few she had clung to after burying so many, were now trapped in the endless rivalry that followed Gwanghae's rule. Some were sidelined, some were disgraced, some were quietly removed from the line of succession. She was a mother forced to watch her children defeated not by illness, not by war, but by politics. It was a different kind of death. Imagine her standing in a palace corridor, looking at her son's chambers from afar, guards stationed outside, ministers walking past without bowing. Her child, her flesh and blood, reduced to a name erased from the records of power. She could do nothing. Her years as queen had taught her silence. Her years as mother had taught her grief. Now her years as dowager taught her powerlessness. The humiliation deepened. When envoys came from Ming China, when court ceremonies took place, when the nation celebrated victories, her presence was barely acknowledged. She was brought forth for form, not for meaning. She was displayed, not respected. She had once been the axis of the palace. Now she was a shadow at its edge. And still she endured. She endured long corridors of whispers. She endured festivals where she sat alone, draped in silks that felt heavier than iron. She endured seeing younger concubines smile in triumph, their children now princes of influence. Her silence became her armor. The chronicles do not say much. They rarely do. They record names, titles, decrees. They do not record humiliation. They do not write of the loneliness of a queen mother forced to fade. They do not capture the bitterness of watching another woman's son sit where hers could not. But we can imagine. At night she sat in her chamber, a single candle flickering against painted screens. She remembered her early days when she was crowned queen. She remembered the king's gaze, sometimes warm, often cold. She remembered her children, laughing in the gardens, then falling silent one by one. And now she remembered what it felt like to be erased while still alive. For humiliation is not only in defeat, it is in invisibility. She still wore the robes of a dowager queen. She still held the title. She still walked through the palace with attendants trailing behind. But none of it mattered. She was a figurehead, a name on parchment, a woman emptied of influence. Her grief was private, her dignity public, her silence eternal. Gwanghae ruled. Ministers schemed. The court pulsed with ambition, and she, the once central queen, was pushed further into the shadows. The age of Gwanghae was remembered for turmoil, reform, division. But for Seongnyeong Wanghu, it was remembered for something else. For humiliation, for erasure, for the bitter truth that survival does not guarantee respect. She had outlived her husband. She had outlived 6 of her children. She had outlived war and famine. And now, she was forced to outlive her own place in history. The Queen Mother sat in silence, and silence was her final crown. In 1635, she died. Seongnyeong Wanghu, Queen of Joseon, passed at 79. No great triumph marked her end. No sweeping victory, no thunder of drums. She slipped away quietly, as she had endured quietly. History recorded her name, her title, her place among the queens of Joseon. But it did not record her grief. It did not record her silence. It did not record the endless funerals of children she buried with trembling hands. She was remembered as consort, as dowager, as relic. Yet beneath those titles, she was something far more universal. She was a mother, a woman who loved, who lost, who endured more than most hearts can bear. Her life reminds us that crowns cannot shield against sorrow, that power cannot protect against loss, that even within palaces, silence can be the heaviest burden. Seongnyeong Wanghu lived long, but not free. She lived honored, but not whole. And in her story, we see the truth of all human lives. That grief is universal, and love endures even when history forgets. She was queen, she was mother, she was human, and in the end, that is her truest legacy.